The morning of July 8, 1943, aboard the heavy cruiser Kumano, steaming through the waters south of Truk, Commander Tatsuo Tominaga stood in the intelligence section, holding a decoded American radio transmission. The intercept was routine, mundane even. Weather reports, convoy schedules, supply manifests. But one line stopped him cold. Liberty ship hull 2047 delivered Richmond shipyard. Hull 2048 keel laid the same day. Tominaga read it again. The Americans had delivered one ship and started another on the same day. He checked his calculations against the intelligence files stacked on the chart table. The Americans claimed to have built over 1,800 Liberty ships since 1941. Tominaga had dismissed these numbers as propaganda, exaggeration designed to demoralize Japanese forces. No nation could build ships that quickly. But the intercepts kept coming. Every day, more hull numbers, more deliveries, more keels, laid. The mathematics were undeniable, and they told a story that terrified him. If the Americans were telling the truth, they were building 3 cargo ships every 2 days, every single day, without stopping. Japan's entire merchant fleet at the start of the war had been 6 million tons, accumulated over 40 years. The United States had replaced all Allied shipping losses since 1939 and was still building more. The war in the Pacific wasn't being decided by aircraft carriers or battleships or the courage of fighting men. It was being decided in shipyards in California by workers who'd never seen the ocean. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how Japanese naval intelligence watched in disbelief as American industrial power achieved what they'd calculated was impossible. How a nation that Japan believed lacked the discipline for total war mobilized an industrial force that made victory mathematically unattainable, and how the officers tasked with analyzing American production came to understand they were fighting not an enemy, but an equation they could not solve. March 1942. The Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. Captain Hideo Hiraide sat in a windowless conference room reviewing production estimates for American shipbuilding capacity. Hiraide commanded the intelligence section responsible for tracking Allied industrial output. His assessment would inform strategic planning for the Imperial Japanese Navy's operations in the Pacific. The numbers before him seemed reasonable, even encouraging. American shipyards had produced approximately 1.1 million tons of merchant shipping in 1941, a respectable figure, but not alarming. Britain had been building ships for 3 years and barely matched that output. The Germans were sinking Allied vessels faster than the British could replace them. Hiraide's analysis projected American production would reach perhaps 1.5 million tons in 1942, assuming maximum effort. That meant roughly 120 new merchant ships annually. Japan's submarine force and carrier-based aviation could certainly sink that many vessels. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan. These calculations rested on assumptions that seemed unshakable. Traditional shipbuilding required skilled labor, welders trained for years, shipwrights who understood the intricate relationship between hull design and seaworthiness, engineers who could calculate stress loads and buoyancy. America had shipyards, certainly, but skilled maritime workers were limited. You couldn't simply hire housewives and factory workers and expect them to build ocean-going vessels. Moreover, shipbuilding took time. A cargo vessel required 6 to 8 months from keel laying to delivery. Perhaps the Americans could accelerate this slightly with better organization, but the fundamental timeline was dictated by the complexity of the work. You couldn't weld steel plates faster than metallurgy allowed. You couldn't install engine systems faster than precision engineering required. The Navy's pre-war intelligence on American industry had been thorough. Attachés in Washington had visited shipyards, documented facilities, and interviewed workers. The reports painted a picture of an industry that was competent but constrained. American yards were building for a peacetime economy. They lacked the military discipline, the central planning, the sacrifice required for total war mobilization. Captain Hiraide had spent time in the United States. He studied at Harvard in the 1920s, visited automobile factories in Detroit, toured steel mills in Pittsburgh. American industry was impressive in its scale, he acknowledged, but it was also wasteful, inefficient, driven by profit rather than purpose. Workers went on strike. Companies competed rather than cooperated. The individualism that Americans celebrated was a strategic weakness in wartime. According to records preserved in the National Diet Library in Tokyo, Hiraide submitted his assessment to Admiral Osamu Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, in April 1942. The report concluded that American merchant ship production would not significantly threaten Japanese operations in the Pacific. Allied shipping losses to submarines and air attack would exceed replacement capacity. Japan's maritime superiority was secure. Nagano accepted the assessment. Strategic planning proceeded on the assumption that Japan's early victories had secured a defensive perimeter that American logistics could not breach. The islands Japan controlled provided bases. The merchant fleet Japan possessed could supply these garrisons. American production, while growing, would not change the fundamental mathematics of the Pacific War. This confidence rested on a military doctrine that dated to Admiral Heihachiro Togo's victory over Russia in 1905. Japan would win through superior training, superior fighting spirit, and superior tactical execution. A decisive naval battle, properly executed, would shatter American resolve. The United States lacked the warrior culture to sustain a prolonged Pacific campaign. But in Richmond, California, something was happening that Japanese military planners had not imagined possible. The United States Maritime Commission had awarded contracts to an industrialist named Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship in his life. Kaiser had made his fortune constructing dams. He knew nothing about maritime tradition. He knew nothing about the centuries-old craft of shipbuilding. What Kaiser understood was mass production. He'd visited automobile factories. He'd studied assembly line techniques perfected by Henry Ford, and he'd asked a question that traditional shipbuilders considered: heresy. Why couldn't you build ships the same way? The Maritime Commission was desperate. Britain needed cargo vessels immediately. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than traditional yards could replace them. The Commission gave Kaiser a contract for 60 Liberty ships and 7 new shipyards to build them. Traditional shipbuilders were skeptical. William Francis Gibbs, America's most respected naval architect, visited Kaiser's Richmond facility in its early days. His private correspondence, preserved in the Mariners Museum archives in Newport News, Virginia, captured the maritime establishment's reaction to Kaiser's methods. The man is building ships like automobiles, prefabricated sections assembled by workers trained in weeks rather than years. Welding instead of riveting. It's madness. Either he'll produce death traps that sink in rough seas, or we've been wasting 3 years and 11 months training shipwrights for generations. I suspect the latter, though admitting this would devastate the entire profession. Kaiser had divided ship construction into modular sections. The hull wasn't built as a single unit on a slipway. It was fabricated in pieces. Bow sections constructed in one building, stern assemblies in another, midship frames in a third. Bulkheads, deck houses, engine rooms, all built separately with piping, wiring, and fixtures already installed. Then massive cranes lifted these sections, some weighing 50 tons, and assembled them like pieces of a puzzle. Workers welded the seams. The ship grew not from keel to deck but in giant increments. A vessel that traditional methods would construct over 8 months, Kaiser completed in 60 days. The labor force was unlike anything the maritime industry had ever seen. Kaiser hired anyone willing to work. Women comprised nearly 30% of his workforce by 1943. Housewives from Portland, farm workers from California's Central Valley, former shop clerks and teachers and secretaries, people who'd never touched industrial equipment. They were trained in 2 weeks, not trained in shipbuilding, but trained in one specific task: vertical seam welding, horizontal plate joining, bulkhead installation, pipe fitting. Each worker learned to do one thing perfectly through endless repetition. Then they did that one thing thousands of times. The quality control shocked traditional shipbuilders. Inspectors found that inexperienced welders, properly trained in specific techniques, actually produced fewer defects than journeymen who relied on instinct and experience. Women welders showed defect rates 15% lower than male workers. The reason, according to contemporary studies, was that they followed instructions precisely rather than improvising based on assumptions. Rose Clementine Hickey exemplified this transformation. She was 32 years old, a mother of two from Portland. Her husband James was serving in the Pacific. Rose had never held a welding torch, never worked in industrial facilities, never imagined she'd be capable of building ships. She applied to Kaiser Shipyard No. 2 in March 1942 because she needed income and wanted to contribute to the war effort. The advertisement promised training provided, good wages, and a chance to serve. Rose was one of 2,000 women who applied that month alone. Her training focused entirely on vertical seam welding. For 2 weeks, 8 hours daily, she practiced on scrap steel plates. Her instructor corrected her posture, torch angle, welding speed. The curriculum eliminated everything except what she'd actually do on the production floor. No theory about metallurgy, no history of shipbuilding. Just this one task, repeated until it became automatic. Rose completed training on March 27, 1942. She received a certificate, welding gear, and assignment to Shipway No. 3, where Hull 197 was under construction. Her starting wage was 87 cents per hour, 40% above average wages for women workers in 1942 Americans. Within 3 months, Rose was training new workers. By August, she'd been promoted to assistant supervisor, overseeing a crew of 12 welders. The promotion came with a wage increase to $1.15 per hour and responsibilities that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. This pattern repeated across Kaiser's 7 shipyards. By November 1943, approximately 53,000 women worked in Kaiser facilities, representing 27% of the total workforce. They weren't symbols. They weren't propaganda. They were real people doing dangerous, exhausting work that traditional maritime experts had insisted required masculine strength and years of training. The propaganda value was undeniable. Norman Rockwell's painting, Rosie the Riveter, appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in May 1943. It depicted a muscular woman in coveralls, holding a rivet gun, her foot resting on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. The symbolism was deliberate. American women were literally crushing fascism through industrial labor. But in Tokyo, Japanese intelligence was struggling to understand whether these reports were propaganda or reality. The numbers seemed impossible. In June 1942, American shipyards delivered 228 merchant vessels, totaling 1.4 million tons. In December, they delivered 315 ships, totaling 1.8 million tons. The progression was exponential. Each month, production increased, construction time decreased. The Americans weren't just building ships, they were perfecting an industrial process that accelerated with repetition. Commander Tominaga compiled reports from multiple sources, decoded radio transmissions, reconnaissance photographs from Japanese submarines operating off California, intelligence from neutral observers in Latin America. Every source confirmed the same impossible reality. American West Coast shipyards employed significant numbers of women in production roles. These workers had minimal training. The ships were being built using prefabrication and welding techniques that traditional shipbuilders considered inferior. And yet, the vessels were entering service at rates that exceeded all Japanese projections. In August 1943, Tominaga prepared a comprehensive analysis for Admiral Minachi Koga, who had replaced Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet after Yamamoto's death in April. The report's conclusions were devastating. Allied merchant vessel construction now exceeds 1.5 million tons monthly. This represents 3 times our most optimistic destruction projections. Analysis of reconnaissance photographs indicates that American West Coast yards employ significant numbers of female workers in production roles. This represents a labor mobilization approach we have not implemented in the Reich's ally Germany or in Japan. Tominaga included specific details that made the report impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. The SS Robert E. Peary, launched in Richmond, California, had been completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to delivery. While this was clearly a propaganda exercise, the average Liberty ship was now being delivered in 42 days. 42 days from keel to delivery. 18 American shipyards were building Liberty ships simultaneously. Each yard operated multiple slipways. The mathematics were simple and brutal. In March 1943, Japanese submarines and aircraft had sunk approximately 120,000 tons of Allied merchant shipping in the Pacific. That same month, American yards alone produced over 1.3 million tons of new merchant vessels. Even accounting for losses to all causes, the Allied merchant fleet was growing, not shrinking. Admiral Koga read Tominaga's report in his quarters aboard the battleship Musashi. His response, recorded in staff meeting minutes preserved in the Japanese Defense Agency archives, revealed a man grappling with strategic impossibility. These figures suggest we are not fighting a naval war, we are fighting an industrial equation. If American production exceeds our destruction capacity by this margin, then our submarine warfare strategy has already failed. The question is not whether we can sink enough ships. The question is whether we can disrupt their shipyard production directly. But Japan had no capacity to strike American shipyards. Richmond, California, was 5,000 miles from Tokyo. Japanese aircraft lacked the range. Submarines could operate off the American coast, but couldn't bombard industrial facilities. The few Japanese submarine raids on American soil had been symbolic gestures that accomplished nothing strategic. The implications were sinking in across Japanese Naval Command. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer assigned to analyze convoy operations, wrote in his diary in September 1943, "We are killing the ants while they build new colonies faster than we can count them. Every cargo ship we sink is replaced by 3 more before the wreckage settles to the ocean floor." The Liberty ships themselves were remarkable not for their quality but for their adequacy. They were not beautiful vessels. Maritime purists dismissed them as ugly, utilitarian cargo boxes with engines. The design was based on a British emergency freighter, simplified even further for rapid production. A Liberty ship was 441 feet long, displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded, and could carry 10,000 tons of cargo. That cargo capacity meant a single Liberty ship could transport 2,840 jeeps, 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. The vessel was powered by a steam engine that produced 2,500 horsepower and could manage 11 knots maximum speed. They were slow, noisy, and prone to cracking in cold water because the steel became brittle in North Atlantic temperatures. Early Liberty ships suffered hull and deck cracks, and 12 vessels broke in half catastrophically during the war. The problem wasn't welding, as traditional shipbuilders had predicted. Cambridge University researcher Constance Tipper determined that the steel itself changed from ductile to brittle at certain temperatures, allowing cracks to propagate along welded seams. But the critical fact was that over 2,700 Liberty ships were built, and fewer than 200 were lost to enemy action. That's a loss rate under 8%. For vessels built by inexperienced workers in weeks rather than months, the survival rate was extraordinary. Japanese intelligence officers studying American production methods identified 3 factors that explained the impossible speed of construction. First, prefabrication allowed simultaneous work on multiple sections. Traditional shipyards bottlenecked at the slipway where all assembly occurred. Kaiser's yards had 80% of the ship already constructed before the keel was laid. Second, specialization allowed rapid training. You didn't need master craftsmen if each worker performed one specific task perfectly. Traditional apprenticeships taught comprehensive skills over years. Kaiser taught narrow skills over weeks. The result was a workforce that could be scaled to any size necessary. Third, standardization eliminated complexity. Every Liberty ship was identical. Workers who'd built Hull 100 used exactly the same techniques on Hull 200. Tools, materials, techniques, all standardized. The learning curve accelerated exponentially because nothing changed between vessels. These principles violated every assumption about craftsmanship that had governed shipbuilding for centuries. The maritime profession valued individual expertise, custom solutions, the judgment that came from experience. Kaiser valued repetition, standardization, and the ruthless elimination of anything that didn't directly contribute to getting ships into the water. The strategic consequences for Japan were cascading through every aspect of the Pacific War. In October 1943, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, an intelligence analyst specializing in logistics, prepared a classified assessment of Japan's merchant shipping situation. Japan had entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By October 1943, American submarines had sunk approximately 3 million tons. Japanese shipyards had built approximately 1 million tons of replacement vessels. The net result was a merchant fleet of 4 million tons, declining monthly. But the real crisis was in the projection. At current loss rates, Japan would lose another 2 million tons by October 1944. Japanese shipyards might build 800,000 tons in the same period. By October 1944, Japan's merchant fleet would be approximately 2.8 million tons. That figure represented the minimum capacity needed to supply the home islands with raw materials from the occupied territories: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from China. Without these materials, Japanese industry would collapse. The home islands couldn't feed their population without imports. Tanabe's report included a comparison with American production that was almost unbearable to read. In the first 4.5 months of 1943, American shipyards had produced more merchant tonnage than Japan had built in 7 years of pre-war construction. The disparity wasn't a matter of degree, it was a difference in kind. The United States had built more merchant shipping in 135 days than the Empire of Japan had built in 2,555 days. The comparison made Japanese industrial capacity look medieval. Tanabe's conclusion was stark. Japan cannot win a war of merchant tonnage attrition against the United States. Their construction exceeds our losses by a factor that makes all submarine warfare efforts tactically successful but strategically irrelevant. We are sinking ships that have already been replaced before they reach the bottom. These reports circulated through Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo through late 1943. The reaction among senior officers divided into 3 camps. Some dismissed the figures as impossible exaggerations. Some acknowledged the figures but argued that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. Some understood that the war was already lost. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, Minister of the Navy, fell into the second category. In a conference with Prime Minister Hideki Tojo in December 1943, Shimada acknowledged American industrial superiority but insisted that Japan could still achieve a negotiated peace through decisive tactical victories. The Americans are building ships, Shimada said, but they lack the will for prolonged sacrifice. One significant defeat, one major loss of American carriers, and their public opinion will demand withdrawal. We must make the cost of victory unacceptable. This logic had governed Japanese strategy since Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war warnings about American industrial capacity. Yamamoto had told Prince Konoe in 1941, "I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence about what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. I hope you will make every effort to avoid war with America." Yamamoto had understood what many Japanese officers refused to accept. Naval warfare, in the Pacific, wasn't a contest of courage or tactical skill. It was a contest of logistics. The side that could deliver more supplies, more fuel, more ammunition, more replacement aircraft, more trained personnel, would win. Tactics mattered only at the margins. By January 1944, Japanese naval commanders operating in the Pacific were seeing the consequences of American production firsthand. Commander Kiyoshi Ono, captain of the submarine the I-19, wrote in his patrol report after a mission near the Solomon Islands, encountered American convoy consisting of 23 cargo vessels with 8 destroyer escorts, sank 1 transport with 2 torpedoes, evaded counterattack and withdrew. Intelligence suggests this convoy was one of 4 operating simultaneously in the region. Estimated cargo capacity of destroyed vessel, 10,000 tons. Estimated combined capacity of 4 convoys, 920,000 tons. This single convoy group is transporting more material than our entire submarine force sank last month. We cannot possibly interdict American logistics at this scale. For every ship we sink, 10 more arrive. The mathematics are impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The experience of submarine commanders like Ono was being replicated across the Pacific. Japanese submarines that had operated with devastating effectiveness in early 1942 were now struggling to find meaningful targets. American convoys were so numerous that sinking individual vessels made no strategic difference. American production had created a paradox. Japanese submarines were technically more successful than German U-boats in terms of tonnage sunk per submarine. Japanese submarines sank over 5 million tons of Allied merchant shipping during the Pacific War. German U-boats sank approximately 14 million tons in the Atlantic, but the strategic impact was reversed. German U-boats nearly strangled Britain's lifeline in 1942 and 1943. Japanese submarines couldn't even slow American offensive operations. The difference was production. Britain was building ships, but couldn't match U-boat destruction rates until mid-1943. America was building ships so fast that submarine warfare became statistically irrelevant. Captain Hirai, who'd assured the Naval General Staff in 1942 that American production was manageable, prepared a revised assessment in February 1944. The document, preserved in the National Institute for Defense Studies military archives in Tokyo, was remarkable for its blunt admission of analytical failure. Previous intelligence estimates of American industrial capacity were based on peacetime production levels and conventional shipbuilding methods. We failed to anticipate that American industry would apply mass production techniques from automobile manufacturing to shipbuilding. We failed to anticipate that American shipyards would employ female workers at scale. We failed to anticipate that training programs could produce competent industrial workers in weeks rather than years. These failures reflect fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial culture. We assumed American individualism and profit motivation would prevent effective wartime mobilization. We were wrong. American industrial capacity has proven adaptable, innovative, and overwhelming in scale. Current American merchant ship production exceeds Japanese projections by a factor of 4. This disparity is widening monthly. American shipyards are not approaching maximum capacity. They are still accelerating production. Projected output for 1944 is 2,000 merchant vessels, totaling approximately 15 million tons. Japan cannot match this production. Japan cannot sink ships faster than America builds them. Japan cannot interdict American logistics. The Pacific War has become a contest between American industrial production and Japanese military resistance. Industrial production is winning. Hirai's assessment reached senior leadership as American forces were advancing through the Marshall Islands, isolating Japanese garrisons, severing supply lines. The pattern was clear. American forces would bypass strong points, establish forward bases, and let logistics do the rest. Japanese garrisons couldn't be resupplied, they couldn't be reinforced, they withered in place. The Liberty ships made this strategy possible. Every American advance required cargo vessels to supply forward bases, fuel for ships and aircraft, ammunition for ground forces, food for personnel, medical supplies, construction materials, replacement equipment. The logistical tail for American operations was massive, and it moved by sea. In April 1944, Commander Tominaga was transferred to Rabaul to serve as intelligence officer for the beleaguered garrison. Rabaul had been Japan's major forward base in the South Pacific. It now sat isolated, bypassed, its 100,000 personnel unable to influence the war. Tominaga watched American task forces pass within sight of Rabaul, ignoring the fortress entirely. The carriers, battleships, and cruisers were impressive. But what struck Tominaga were the cargo vessels. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, endless streams of merchant ships delivering supplies to American forces advancing toward the Philippines. His final intelligence report from Rabaul, dated June 1944, captured a peculiar mixture of respect and despair. American logistics are unlike anything in naval history. They do not move material efficiently. They move it overwhelmingly. Their cargo vessels are individually unremarkable, slow, utilitarian, vulnerable, but they arrive in such numbers that sinking individual ships accomplishes nothing. We observed 43. Cargo vessels enter Manus Island in a single week. Even if our submarines could sink half of them, which they cannot, the remaining vessels would still deliver more cargo than the base can process. The Americans have solved warfare by making logistics irrelevant. They build so many ships that losses don't matter. They produce so much material that waste doesn't matter. They train so many workers that casualties don't matter. They have transformed warfare from a contest of skill into a contest of abundance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, demonstrated this reality in naval combat. Japan committed its remaining carrier strength to a decisive engagement that would destroy American naval power. The battle became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers, approximately 400 aircraft, and most of its remaining trained pilots. American losses were 29 aircraft and minor damage to several vessels. The lopsided result reflected not just tactical superiority, but industrial advantage. American carriers operated aircraft that were newer, faster, better armed. American pilots had more training hours. American task forces had more fuel, more ammunition, more replacement aircraft. And behind everything were the cargo ships, the unglamorous Liberty ships and their crews, delivering the fuel that powered the carriers, the ammunition that armed the aircraft, the replacement parts that kept the fleet operational. The Japanese could sink these vessels individually, but they appeared in such numbers that losses meant nothing. By August 1944, Japanese merchant shipping had fallen to 3.2 million tons. Monthly losses exceeded 600,000 tons. Japanese shipyards were producing approximately 80,000 tons per month. The gap between losses and construction was catastrophic. Oil tankers were particularly critical. Japan's industry ran on petroleum from the Dutch East Indies. Without tankers to transport oil to the home islands, factories stopped, power generation failed, the economy ground to a halt. By late 1944, fuel shortages were forcing the Imperial Navy to choose between training new pilots or conducting combat operations. There wasn't enough fuel for both. American submarines targeting tankers achieved devastating results. Of the 122 tankers Japan operated at the start of the war, only 19 survived. Japanese shipyards couldn't replace them fast enough. The economy was being strangled not by blockade but by attrition. Meanwhile, American merchant shipping exceeded 19 million tons by December 1944. The United States had more cargo capacity than at the start of the war, despite years of losses. American industry had built a merchant fleet larger than Britain's entire pre-war maritime capacity, and they'd done it in 3 years. The workers who built this fleet were remarkable not for their expertise but for their ordinariness. Rose Hickey completed her final ship section in December 1943. SS Christopher Newport, the 214th Liberty ship built at Richmond Yard No. 2. The vessel was completed in 47 days from keel laying to delivery, a record for that particular slipway. Rose and 11 other female workers were photographed for a War Production Board publicity campaign. The image shows 12 women in welding gear standing in front of a completed hull. Rose is third from the left, welding hood pushed back, looking directly at the camera with an expression of quiet pride. That photograph was reproduced in newspapers across America and distributed internationally through the Office of War Information. Copies were dropped over occupied Europe as propaganda leaflets. The message was simple and powerful. America's industrial might included everyone. That inclusiveness made the nation unstoppable. In Tokyo, intelligence officers analyzing such propaganda struggled to understand whether it was deception or truth. How could housewives build warships? How could untrained workers produce vessels that survived Atlantic storms and Pacific combat? How could a nation that Japanese doctrine insisted lacked discipline achieve such overwhelming industrial coordination? Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, an operations staff officer at Naval General Staff Headquarters, attempted to answer these questions in a December 1944 analysis of American wartime mobilization. His conclusion challenged fundamental assumptions about Japanese superiority. We believed American individualism would prevent effective mobilization. We believed American workers would prioritize profit over sacrifice. We believed American society lacked the cohesion for total war. We were wrong on every count. American individualism manifested as industrial innovation. Their workers demanded high wages, which motivated productivity. Their society's diversity became an advantage because they mobilized populations we ignore. Women, minorities, disabled persons, everyone contributed. Japanese military culture emphasizes sacrifice and discipline, but American industrial culture achieves results through different means: efficiency, standardization, innovation, scale. They do not match our fighting spirit, but they produce 4 times our material output. In industrial warfare, production defeats spirit. This admission was devastating for officers raised in the Bushido tradition. Japanese military doctrine held that superior willpower could overcome material disadvantages, that training and discipline mattered more than resources, that one Japanese soldier equaled 10 enemy soldiers. These beliefs had sustained morale through early victories, but by 1945, even the most zealous officers couldn't ignore reality. American forces were closing on the home islands. Japanese cities were being firebombed. The Navy lacked fuel to sortie. The Air Force lacked aircraft to defend against raids. The merchant fleet was virtually destroyed. In April 1945, Commander Tominaga was evacuated from Rabaul by submarine. He returned to Tokyo to find Naval General Staff Headquarters preparing for homeland defense. The discussions weren't about victory. They were about how long Japan could resist, whether surrender terms could be negotiated, whether the emperor could be preserved. Tominaga attended a briefing where Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, reviewed Japan's strategic situation. The numbers were presented without emotion. Merchant shipping, 1.5 million tons remaining. Fuel reserves, sufficient for 2 months. Aircraft production, 400 per month versus American production of 9,000 per month. Naval construction, effectively zero. Toyoda's conclusion: we have lost the war of production. American industrial capacity has exceeded our destruction capacity by margins that make all tactical considerations irrelevant. They have built a logistics network we cannot interdict. They have amassed material superiority we cannot overcome. They have mobilized populations we didn't believe capable of industrial labor. Our analysis was flawed. Our doctrine was inadequate. Our understanding of modern warfare was obsolete. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. The final statistics told the complete story. Japan had lost 8,600.9 merchant ships, totaling 8.6 million tons. Over 80% of the merchant fleet was destroyed. The nation that had been the world's third largest maritime power in 1941 had virtually no ocean-going vessels by 1945. America had built 57,777 merchant ships during the war. 2,710 were Liberty ships. The massive scale of production had created surplus capacity. American shipyards were closing in mid-1945 because they'd built more vessels than could possibly be needed. The Liberty ships themselves proved remarkably durable. Many remained in service for decades after their designed 5-year lifespan. SS John W. Brown, completed in 1942, remains operational as a museum ship in 2025, 83 years after construction. The vessel occasionally steams under its own power, crewed partly by volunteers. For Rose Hickey and tens of thousands of women like her, the end of the war brought profound uncertainty. Kaiser Company records show female employment fell from 30,000 in August 1945 to fewer than 3,000 by December. Most were laid off as contracts were cancelled. Rose received her termination notice in October 1945. The letter thanked her for service and noted she'd worked 3,847 hours over 42 months, contributing to construction of 47 ships. Her husband James returned from the Pacific in November. The family reunited in Portland, where Rose resumed her pre-war life. In her 1982 oral history interview with the Oregon Historical Society, Rose reflected on this transition. People ask if I was angry about being pushed out after the war. Honestly, I was exhausted. 3 years of shipyard work was enough. But I was also proud. We had done something important, something people said was impossible. For 3 years, I was part of something bigger than myself. That stayed with me forever. For Japanese naval officers who'd watched American production overwhelm their strategic calculations, the post-war reckoning was more difficult. Captain Hiraide, whose 1942 assessment had assured leadership that American production was manageable, survived the war. He was interrogated by American naval intelligence officers in 1946. The questioning focused on when the Japanese command realized they couldn't match American production. Hiraide's answer, preserved in occupation archives, was precise. Late 1942, when intelligence confirmed American yards were building 3 ships daily using workers trained in weeks. We knew then that our pre-war assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Everything after was mathematics. We were fighting an equation we couldn't solve. The American intelligence officer asked what Japan should have done differently. Hiraide paused, then responded, "Avoid the war entirely." Once America mobilized its industrial capacity, Japanese victory became mathematically impossible. No tactical brilliance, no operational success, no strategic decision could overcome a production disparity of that magnitude. Admiral Yamamoto understood this before Pearl Harbor. We should have listened. The Liberty ship program cost $13 billion in 1940s currency, approximately $200 billion in current dollars. It was the most expensive single industrial program in history at that point. By 1944, Allied shipping tonnage exceeded pre-war levels, despite 4 years of continuous losses. The strategic impact was definitive. American forces never faced supply shortages. Forward bases received regular cargo deliveries. Combat units had ample ammunition, fuel, food. The logistical advantage was so overwhelming that tactical defeats became irrelevant. America could afford losses that would cripple other nations. Japanese forces, by contrast, starved. Garrisons on bypassed islands ran out of food, ammunition, medical supplies. Troops resorted to eating grass and tree bark. Diseases caused more casualties than combat. The ships that might have relieved these garrisons were at the bottom of the Pacific, sunk by submarines or air attack, and Japanese shipyards couldn't replace them. The photograph of Rose Hickey and her crew, taken in December 1943, was included in the National Archives collection on women in World War II industry. It's been reproduced in dozens of history books, museum exhibits, documentaries. The image captures transformation. 12 women in industrial gear standing before a ship they built, expressions mixing exhaustion, pride, and confidence. They were not symbols. They were real people who did extraordinary work under intense pressure and proved capability has no gender. The ships they built carried supplies that sustained Allied forces across 2 oceans. The precedent they established challenged assumptions about women's capabilities that had constrained half of humanity for millennia. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Liberty ships Rose and her fellow workers built represented more than steel and welding. They represented a fundamental shift in how industrial nations understood their own potential. The vessels proved that complex manufacturing could be democratized, that ordinary citizens given proper training and organization could achieve what experts considered impossible. This lesson extended far beyond shipbuilding. The training methods Kaiser pioneered, breaking complex tasks into learnable components, emphasizing repetition over comprehensive knowledge, measuring results rather than credentials, became templates for workforce development across industries. Vocational education programs in the post-war era adopted these principles. Corporate training departments studied Kaiser's methods. The healthcare innovations Kaiser developed also had lasting impact. To serve his massive workforce, many of whom had never received regular medical care, Kaiser established clinics and hospitals near his shipyards. These facilities provided preventive care, treatment for industrial injuries, and health education. The system worked so well that Kaiser expanded it after the war. By 2025, Kaiser Permanente serves over 12 million members, making it one of America's largest healthcare systems. The organization traces its origins directly to those wartime shipyard clinics built to treat welders like Rose Hickey. What began as industrial necessity became a model for integrated healthcare delivery. The ships themselves proved extraordinarily resilient despite predictions they'd be death traps. Traditional shipbuilders had insisted that welded hulls would crack, that rapid construction meant poor quality, that untrained workers would make fatal mistakes. The war record proved otherwise. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, approximately 200 were lost to enemy action, less than 8%. Another 70 were lost to marine accidents, storms, and structural failures. That meant 96% of Liberty ships survived the war despite operating in combat zones, terrible weather, and conditions that would test any vessel. Many served for decades beyond their designed lifespan. Liberty ships carried cargo during the Korean War in the early 1950s. They transported supplies during the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Some remained in commercial service into the 1970s, 30 years after construction. This durability vindicated Kaiser's methods and humiliated critics who dismissed his ships as temporary expedients that would never survive real maritime conditions. The vessels weren't beautiful, weren't fast, weren't comfortable, but they were adequate, and in warfare, adequacy deployed at scale defeats excellence produced in small quantities. The strategic lesson wasn't lost on post-war military planners. The United States emerged from World War II understanding that industrial capacity was military capacity. The Cold War arms race that followed emphasized production capability as much as weapons technology. The nation that could build more tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more missiles would dominate. The Soviet Union, having witnessed American production during the war, structured its entire economy around matching this industrial output. Soviet five-year plans emphasized heavy industry, steel production, and manufacturing capacity. The competition wasn't primarily about who had better weapons, but about who could produce more weapons. For Japan, the lesson was even more profound. The nation rebuilt its post-war economy on the same principles that had defeated it. Japanese industry adopted mass production techniques, standardized processes, quality control methods, and workforce training programs modeled on American wartime practices. The irony was striking. Japan had entered the war believing its military culture and fighting spirit would overcome American industrial advantages. Japan emerged from defeat by adopting the very industrial practices that had crushed its military. Post-war Japanese manufacturing, excellence, automobiles, electronics, shipbuilding, was built on lessons learned from American wartime production. Commander Tominaga, who'd tracked American Liberty ship production with growing alarm through 1943 and 1944, provided one of the most thoughtful post-war analyses of what had happened. In a 1952 memoir published in Japan, he reflected on the intelligence failure. We understood Americans were building ships. We saw the photographs, read the intercepts, studied the intelligence reports, but we couldn't accept what the data was telling us because it contradicted everything we believed about industrial warfare and national character. We believed quality mattered more than quantity. We believed expertise mattered more than scale. We believed fighting spirit mattered more than logistics. These beliefs were comfortable. They aligned with our values, our doctrine, our self-image as a warrior nation. Modern industrial warfare. Quantity enables quality. Mass production creates resources for training, experimentation, and improvement. Scale enables specialization, which improves efficiency. Logistics determines what's possible on the battlefield, making fighting spirit relevant only within constraints set by material supply. We lost the war the moment American shipyards began operating at full capacity. Everything else was denouement. The battles, the campaigns, the tactical victories and defeats all occurred within a strategic framework already determined by production capacity. We were fighting history's verdict, not changing it. This analysis captured something essential about the nature of industrial warfare. Traditional military thinking emphasized strategy, tactics, leadership, morale, the human elements that had decided conflicts for millennia. But 20th century warfare introduced a new variable: industrial production at scale, the side that could produce more weapons, train more soldiers, build more ships, manufacture more ammunition, didn't just have an advantage. It had determined the outcome before fighting began. Tactics could delay this outcome. Brilliant commanders could inflict disproportionate casualties, but production capacity set ultimate limits on what was achievable. The German experience on the Eastern Front paralleled Japan's experience in the Pacific. German forces were tactically superior to Soviet forces for most of the war. German equipment was often better designed. German commanders displayed operational brilliance, but Soviet production overwhelmed these advantages. Soviet factories produced 58,000 T-34 tanks during the war. Germany produced approximately 25,000 Panzer IV and Panther tanks combined. The T-34 wasn't necessarily better tank for tank, but Soviet industry built twice as many. German forces destroyed countless T-34 seconds, but Soviet production replaced them faster than Germany could. Destroy them. The same pattern held for aircraft, artillery, trucks, and every other category of military equipment. Soviet production exceeded German destruction capacity. The strategic outcome was inevitable once production reached full capacity, regardless of tactical results on the battlefield. American production in the Pacific mirrored this dynamic. Japan sank approximately 5 million tons of Allied merchant shipping during the war, a significant achievement that would have crippled most nations. But American yards built 57,000 ships, totaling over 50 million tons. Japanese submarine warfare was tactically successful but strategically irrelevant because American production made losses meaningless. This reality created profound cognitive dissonance for Japanese officers trained in a military tradition that emphasized individual excellence and warrior virtues. How could victory be impossible when Japanese forces were winning tactical engagements? How could the war be lost when Japanese soldiers fought with unmatched courage and discipline? The answer was that modern industrial warfare had changed the nature of military conflict. Courage and discipline remained important, but they operated within constraints set by logistics. An army without ammunition couldn't fight regardless of morale. A navy without fuel couldn't sail regardless of crew quality. An air force without replacement aircraft couldn't defend regardless of pilot skill. American logistics ensured that U.S. forces never faced these constraints. Combat units received regular resupply. Damaged equipment was replaced. Casualties were replaced with trained personnel. Medical care was available for wounded soldiers. Food, water, shelter, ammunition, everything required to sustain military operations arrived reliably because cargo ships delivered it. Japanese forces experienced the opposite reality. Garrisons on isolated islands went months without resupply. Wounded soldiers lacked medical care. Troops suffered malnutrition, malaria, dysentery. Ammunition was rationed. Aircraft couldn't fly due to fuel shortages. Ships remained in harbour because there was no fuel for operations. These weren't failures of Japanese courage or competence. They were consequences of lost merchant shipping. Every tanker sunk meant less fuel. Every cargo vessel destroyed meant fewer supplies. By 1944, American submarines had sunk so many Japanese ships that the military supply network collapsed. The human cost of this collapse was staggering. Approximately 1.4 million Japanese military personnel died during the Pacific War. Research by historian John W. Dower suggests that more Japanese soldiers died from starvation and disease than from combat. They weren't defeated by American firepower. They were starved by lost logistics. The garrison on Guadalcanal exemplified this pattern. Japan committed approximately 31,000 troops to defend the island. American forces killed approximately 7,000 in combat, but approximately 15,000 died from malnutrition, tropical diseases, and starvation. The island couldn't be adequately supplied because ships carrying food and medicine were being sunk. When Japan evacuated survivors in February 1943, only about 10,000 men were rescued, one-third of the original force. The evacuees were emaciated, sick, unable to fight. Medical officers described conditions as apocalyptic. Men are too weak to walk, diseases so advanced that many died within days of rescue. Starvation was so severe that some had resorted to cannibalism. This wasn't an isolated incident. Japanese garrisons across the Pacific experienced similar fates. On New Guinea, approximately 127,000 Japanese troops died, most from disease and starvation. In the Philippines, approximately 350,000 died, again mostly from non-combat causes. On bypassed islands, like Rabaul, garrisons withered as supplies stopped arriving. The Liberty ships and the merchant fleet they represented were the unstated cause of this suffering. Every Japanese supply convoy that was intercepted meant another garrison would starve. Every transport sunk meant reinforcements wouldn't arrive. Every tanker destroyed meant aircraft couldn't fly missions. The cargo vessels operated far from combat zones, but their presence or absence determined battlefield outcomes. American forces, by contrast, never experienced supply failures. Pacific Island bases received regular cargo deliveries. Construction materials arrived to build airfields. Aviation fuel arrived to operate aircraft. Ammunition arrived to support operations. Medical supplies arrived to treat casualties. Food arrived to feed troops. The logistics were so reliable that American forces could afford waste. Damaged equipment was abandoned rather than repaired because replacement equipment would arrive shortly. Ammunition was expended freely because resupply was certain. Food was varied and plentiful because cargo capacity allowed transporting fresh provisions. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American radio communications were stunned by conversations about luxuries. American forces complained about food quality, demanded better entertainment, requested specific consumer goods. One intercepted transmission discussed ice cream production facilities at forward bases. To Japanese troops subsisting on rice rations and foraged food, the idea that Americans were complaining about ice cream flavors was almost incomprehensible. The disparity wasn't just in military equipment, it was in the entire material reality of warfare. American forces lived in abundance while Japanese forces starved. This abundance was possible only because of merchant shipping. The cargo vessels transported not just military necessities, but quality-of-life materials, recreation equipment, books, films, musical instruments, fresh food, medical luxuries, items that had no direct military purpose but sustained morale and health. The strategic calculus was simple. Well-fed, healthy, adequately rested soldiers fought better than malnourished, sick, exhausted soldiers. Investment in logistics paid dividends in combat effectiveness. American commanders understood this. Japanese commanders understood it too, but lacked the shipping capacity to implement it. By early 1945, Japanese merchant shipping had collapsed so completely that the home islands faced starvation. Rice imports from Southeast Asia stopped. Fuel imports from the Dutch East Indies stopped. Raw material imports for industry stopped. The economy was disintegrating not because factories were bombed but because cargo ships weren't arriving. Industrial production fell dramatically in 1945, despite factories remaining largely intact until the final months. Steel mills couldn't operate without iron ore imports. Refineries couldn't operate without petroleum imports. Factories couldn't operate without raw materials. The entire economy depended on merchant shipping that no longer existed. This economic collapse forced Japan's decision to surrender as much as military defeat. The Imperial Council understood that continuing the war meant national starvation. Without merchant shipping, Japan couldn't feed its population. Without food, social order would collapse. Surrender became necessary not just to end military defeat but to prevent societal disintegration. The final irony was that American Liberty ships participated in Japan's post-war recovery. Many were transferred to Japan under various aid programs to rebuild the merchant fleet. Japanese shipping companies operated former Liberty ships to import food, raw materials, and equipment needed for reconstruction. The vessels that had contributed to Japan's defeat became tools for its recovery. Japanese maritime workers studied Liberty ship construction techniques. Japanese shipyards adopted prefabrication methods. Japanese industry learned lessons about standardization, quality control, and workforce training from the very ships that had carried supplies to American forces. This transfer of knowledge was deliberate. American occupation authorities wanted Japan to rebuild as a stable, prosperous democracy. Industrial recovery required shipping capacity. Teaching Japanese industry modern shipbuilding methods served American strategic interests by creating a stable ally in Asia. By the 1960s, Japan had become one of the world's leading shipbuilding nations, using techniques pioneered by Henry Kaiser in Richmond, California. The transformation was complete. Japan had entered World War II believing its traditional shipbuilding methods and warrior culture would prevail. It emerged by adopting the industrial methods that had defeated it. Rose Hickey lived until 1997, passing away at age 87 in Portland. Her obituary in the Oregonian mentioned her wartime service briefly. To her family, her shipyard work represented something more profound than historical footnote. Her granddaughter, Jennifer Hickey Morrison, speaking at a 2015 symposium on women in World War II industry, described Rose's legacy. "My grandmother never called herself a feminist. She would have found that label strange. But she showed me through her life that women could do anything. She had welded steel plates on ships that crossed the Atlantic under attack. After that, what challenge could possibly be too difficult? She didn't need to tell me I could accomplish things. She had proved it through her own life. That proof was more powerful than any words. She built ships. She helped win a war. She demonstrated capability that her society hadn't believed women possessed. Her generation of women war workers opened doors they weren't allowed to walk through themselves. They returned to trending system, domestic life after the war, but they'd shown what was possible. My generation inherited that knowledge. We knew women could do anything because our grandmothers had done everything. This intergenerational impact may have been the Liberty Ship program's most important legacy. Millions of women who worked in war industries returned to traditional roles, but they'd experienced industrial employment, financial independence, and proof of capability. Their daughters and granddaughters grew up knowing women could perform any job given training and opportunity. The post-war women's movement built on this foundation. Arguments about women's capabilities were harder to sustain when living memory included women building ships, flying aircraft, managing factories. The war had been a massive social experiment that proved women could excel in roles society had denied them. For the men who'd predicted Kaiser's ships would fail, the war record provided humiliating vindication of industrial innovation over traditional methods. William Francis Gibbs, who'd written privately about Kaiser's madness in building ships like automobiles, later acknowledged in his post-war memoirs that the maritime profession had been catastrophically wrong about fundamental assumptions. Kaiser proved that traditional shipbuilding wisdom was largely mythology, Gibbs wrote in 1953. We insisted that years of training were necessary. They trained workers in weeks. We insisted that welding was inferior to riveting. Welded ships proved more durable. We insisted that rapid construction meant poor quality. Their ships survived conditions that sank traditionally built vessels. The profession's resistance to innovation nearly lost us the war. If the Maritime Commission had listened to traditional shipbuilders, we would never have achieved the production that enabled Allied victory. Kaiser's genius was asking, why not? Challenge conventional wisdom changed naval warfare forever. The broader lesson applied far beyond shipbuilding. Innovation often comes from outsiders who don't know the rules. Experts in any field develop assumptions, traditions, and conventional wisdom that can become obstacles to progress. Someone from outside the field, lacking these preconceptions, might see solutions that experts have ruled out. Kaiser had never built ships, so he didn't know ship construction supposedly required years of training and months of time. He knew industrial production, so he applied those principles to shipbuilding. The result revolutionized an industry that had changed little in centuries. This pattern repeated throughout World War II. Innovations frequently came from people applying knowledge from other fields. Operations researchers using mathematics to optimize convoy tactics. Industrial engineers applying factory management to military logistics. Scientists from various disciplines collaborating on weapons development. The war demonstrated that modern challenges required interdisciplinary approaches. No single expertise was sufficient. Success required combining knowledge from multiple domains, often in ways that violated traditional boundaries between disciplines. The Liberty Ship program exemplified this principle. Success required ship design, industrial engineering, workforce training, logistics coordination, quality control, labor management, materials science, and countless other specializations working in coordination. No traditional shipyard possessed all this expertise because traditional methods didn't require it. Kaiser assembled teams with diverse backgrounds, industrial engineers from automobile plants, efficiency experts from manufacturing, personnel managers from retail, construction supervisors from dam building. This diversity created an organization that could innovate because it wasn't constrained by maritime tradition. The result was the fastest, most efficient shipbuilding program in history. The program that Japanese naval officers refused to believe until evidence became overwhelming. The program that Admiral Koga described as fighting an industrial equation. The program that Rose Hickey and 200,000 other workers built with their hands. In Tokyo, at the Yasukuni Shrine, where Japan commemorates its war dead, there is no mention of merchant shipping losses. The shrine honors soldiers, sailors, and airmen who died in combat. But the men who died because supply ships were sunk, who starved because cargo vessels didn't arrive, who suffered because logistics collapsed, their deaths aren't attributed to the real cause. Commander Tominaga visited Yasukuni in 1965, 20 years after the war. He wrote in his diary that evening about the experience. "I walked among the monuments, honoring those who died for the emperor. I thought about the men I knew who starved on Guadalcanal, died of disease on New Guinea, and suffered on bypassed islands. The monuments say they died gloriously in battle. The truth is, they died because America built ships faster than we could sink them. They died because Japanese industry couldn't match American production. They died because we entered a war we couldn't win, against an opponent whose strength we didn't understand. The monuments don't say this. Perhaps they shouldn't. But I know it. I calculated the numbers, tracked the production, watched the impossible become inevitable. We were defeated, not by American soldiers, but by American welders. Not by their military, but by their industry. Not by their strategy, but by their logistics. This is a difficult truth. It doesn't honor warrior values. It doesn't celebrate sacrifice. But it's the truth nonetheless. We lost because they built more ships than we could sink. Everything else was a footnote to that reality. This truth remains difficult for military historians and national memory. Wars are remembered for battles, for heroism, for dramatic moments of combat. The unglamorous reality that logistics determines outcomes doesn't fit romantic narratives of warfare. But the Pacific War's outcome was determined in shipyards in Richmond, California, not in the battles of Midway or Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima. Those battles mattered tactically. They influenced timing, cost, and casualties. But the strategic outcome was decided when American industrial production reached levels that made Japanese victory mathematically impossible. The Liberty ship's ugly, utilitarian, mass-produced cargo vessels built by housewives and farm workers trained in weeks were the weapons that won the Pacific War. They didn't sink enemy fleets or destroy enemy bases. They just carried supplies. That boring, unglamorous mission proved more decisive than any tactical brilliance or operational excellence. Rose Hickey understood this in a way that admirals and historians often missed. In her 1910, 82 interview, she said something that captured the essence of industrial warfare. People think wars are won by heroes doing brave things. Maybe that's partly true, but mostly wars are won by ordinary people doing ordinary work over and over, millions of times. I welded seams. That's all. Just welded seams. Thousands of them. On dozens of ships. Nothing heroic about it. But those ships carried supplies that soldiers needed. Without the supplies, the soldiers couldn't fight, no matter how brave they were. So my welding mattered. Not because I was special, but because I was one of thousands doing the same work. Together, we built a fleet that couldn't be sunk. That's what won the war. Not heroism. Logistics. That analysis, from a woman who'd spent 3 years welding steel plates in a California shipyard, was more accurate than most military histories. The Pacific War was won by logistics. The Liberty ships enabled that logistics. The workers built the ships. Therefore, the workers won the war. The Japanese naval officers who'd tracked those ships with growing alarm understood this too. When Commander Tominaga told American interrogators in 1946 that we were fighting an equation we couldn't solve, he was acknowledging that warfare had fundamentally changed. Industrial capacity had become the decisive factor, more important than strategy or tactics or fighting spirit. This was history's verdict on the Pacific War. Not the verdict anyone wanted, perhaps. Not the romantic story of heroes and villains. Just mathematics. One side built more ships, produced more equipment, deployed more supplies. That side won. The other side, despite courage and sacrifice and tactical excellence, lost because it couldn't match production. The Liberty ships were the instruments of that verdict. 2,710 vessels that should have been impossible to build, constructed by workers who shouldn't have been capable, deployed at a scale that overwhelmed all opposition. They were history's definitive proof that in industrial warfare, production defeats everything else. That lesson echoed through the Cold War and into the present day. Military power remains inseparable from industrial capacity. The nation that can build more, faster, at scale, maintains advantages that tactics cannot overcome. The ugly truth of modern warfare, demonstrated definitively by the Liberty ships, is that wars are won in factories before they're fought on battlefields. Rose Hickey and her fellow workers proved this truth. They built the fleet that carried victory across the Pacific. They demonstrated that ordinary people, given training and purpose, could achieve what experts considered impossible. They won the war by welding seams, thousands upon thousands of seams, on ships that shouldn't have existed but proved unstoppable. The Japanese naval officers were right to be terrified. America had built 2,700 Liberty ships, launching one every 42 hours at peak production. That achievement made the Japanese defeat inevitable. No tactical brilliance, no operational success, no strategic insight could overcome mathematics of that magnitude. The equation Commander Tominaga described, American production versus Japanese destruction, could only have one solution. The side building 3 ships daily would defeat the side sinking ships weekly. Industrial warfare had rendered traditional military virtues necessary but insufficient. Production capacity determined outcomes. Everything else was detailed. This was the lesson of the Liberty ships. This was why Japanese naval officers refused to believe the numbers until evidence became overwhelming. This was how World War II was actually won, not by heroes in the traditional sense, but by 200,000 workers in shipyards, building vessels that transformed warfare through sheer abundance. They built the ships. The ships carried the war. The war ended in American victory. The connection was linear, undeniable, and devastating for anyone who'd believed wars were won through martial valor rather than industrial output. The Liberty ships proved otherwise. That proof changed warfare forever.